Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It's a great pleasure to be here and to have such a wonderful introduction. And it falls to me today to speak, and this is such a wonderful title, I'm not sure if I can remember it off by heart, Working with the Angels, Community Building in the Digital Age. So, I want to give a very brief introduction to the source from which I'm drawing in this talk. But when I woke up this morning and read the paper, I realized that the context had changed since I was planning the talk yesterday evening and in the previous days. So after a brief introduction, I'm going to just subtly turn everything on its head and take us through a slightly different process. The brief introduction really is just, in a way, following on from things that Lawrence has already touched on. Just to become aware that for most of history, and indeed even now for large parts of the world, it's an utterly self-evident matter that our lives, our destinies, the destinies of families, communities, nations, of our age, and the created world itself, and maybe even beyond that, manifest being itself, are the outworking of what we could call intelligences, minds, focuses of, to use Lawrence's words, love and wisdom, which are in infinite webs of relationship with each other, cascading down what we sometimes call the angelic hierarchies, and with the elemental beings, the beings of nature, and with the world and human beings themselves. So it's really, we're sort of in the minority that we have a consciousness, some of us sitting here at least, which more or less, well, that doesn't just experience that as a natural matter of fact. Some of us may be used to living with the idea of what we can sometimes call the angels, other intelligences, but I can say for myself, having been working in this kind of area in a focused way for about the last 7 years, and in a general way for about the last 30 years, I'm constantly astonished at my capacity to forget all about the reality of spiritual worlds and their effect on the life, on our life, when everyday concerns take over. So there would be many examples from ancient mythologies and scriptures and the life of what are sometimes called the primal religions or the animistic religions of today to illustrate this companionship that human beings have felt and still feel with beings of a higher order that nevertheless are concerned with our world and with whom we can have some kind of dealings. Heraclitus, really the first of the philosophers, the so-called pre-Socratic philosophers, he says, the world is filled with beings of soul and spirit. What reality is beings. And it was quite a distinct moment in what Rudolf Steiner calls the evolution of consciousness, when it seemingly became important that some human beings, those in the West, let's say, actually were forbidden to have this experience. And ironic though it seems, the author, the instigator of this change in consciousness was the church. And the moment, it's one of those moments that one can actually pin down to a particular year, although of course the transition took more than just a day, but one can pin it down to the Council of Nicaea in the year 325, when what we sometimes call a cosmic Christology, cosmic in this sense meaning worldly, cosmos is the world. So there was a vision of Christ at work in creation, and probably still an old echo of the Gnostic systems of Christ as the kind of summation of all the beings of the spiritual hierarchies. And there was a moment when it was important for that insight and that world of religious feeling to be banished and outlawed. And from that flowed then the program of destruction of what became called paganism in the 380s under Theodosius, sometimes called the Great, where the sacred groves were pulled down and the temples were overturned, and a lot of rather dreadful things happened in the name of Christ. But perhaps one can imagine a certain experience of loneliness was made possible, an experience of not being part of a community of spiritual beings through which other things became possible. And the source for what I'm going to briefly present to you today is really mainly, almost entirely, drawn from the work of Rudolf Steiner, who, interestingly, had no desire to turn the clock back and get back beyond 325 and the Council of Nicaea and go back to the kind of embedded consciousness that probably obtained before then, but whose life task it was to marry his capacity for spiritual insight with a modern, rigorous, scientific thinking path, probably very much in line with what Lawrence said, outlining the science of the future, which, of course, can look like the magic of today. And of the many, many things that Rudolf Steiner spoke about in his really thousands and thousands of lectures and many, many books, one theme that goes through really from 1900 until 1925, when he died, is the reality of the spiritual hierarchies and suggestions about how to work with them. The main suggestion really being something that hopefully will become possible through what we can do together today. Not so much that one tries to roll one's eyes back and part a velvet curtain and see a golden cherub with a trumpet, which sometimes in the angel literature, of course, which is very widespread now, seems to be the suggestion. But rather that one works with quite clear concepts and doesn't take them on trust so much as adopt them as hypotheses to see whether they help to make sense of our experiences. And those of you, some of you may be familiar with Rudolf Steiner's work, may know that in a way, that's the primary way that we can engage with all the rather amazing insights that he brings us. We can only try them out and see whether they make sense of our experience. You could also say we try them out to see whether they allow us to work in the world, to do our work, to do our service more purposefully, more richly, and with greater possibilities of loving And if they're useful for that, then we can maybe keep them and build on them. And if they're not, then we probably shouldn't. So, when we think about the angels, as they're traditionally called, the spiritual hierarchies, in a way, we have a kind of help now, different than even 10 or 20 years ago, in the reality of what Lawrence referred to, our digital world, because it's no longer surprising to think of something like a global intelligence. We now start to see, I suspect, we're starting to be able to sense the contours of what is being prepared through the information revolution, the internet, and so on. When I first, as a habitual early adopter, when I first started writing emails and things like that, some of my colleagues, who are far more grounded and sensible than I am, were very, very wary and told me this is probably all going to end in tears. And I remember at the time thinking, well, I think sending an email is probably, as long as you're careful that you don't try and write about anything complicated or emotional, that communicating information by email is actually a fairly good and relatively harmless thing. But it's probably going to be a few steps that are needed before we start to see what or even who is at work behind this incredible web that is beginning to enclose the world. And I think these last couple of years probably have allowed us to start to see that out of the many, many nodes of information, data, which are held all over the world, a kind of emerging global intelligence can be discerned, and even perhaps an emerging global will, which we, of course, can harness in events such as this with live streaming and so on, but whose main intentions maybe, one could wonder whether they have only to do with good will. So I'll leave that on one side, perhaps for questions in the session. But nevertheless, it can serve to prepare us for the idea that there are indeed intelligences in the world, minds, which are not embodied. And that, of course, is the thought which has, as I've outlined, always been there, of angelic beings, spiritual guides, spiritual helpers, which are not physically embodied. And normally we think of these minds starting from our own standpoint. And even today, many people, a surprisingly large number of people, when asked in surveys, say that they believe, or they even perhaps have some experience of their own angel, of a guardian angel, of a guiding genius, what the Greeks called the daimon. And we think of these minds then ascending, or perhaps you could say widening. So we have the image of radii of awareness, increasing radii of awareness. So the angel who has the capacity to accompany a human being through a lifetime. Perhaps if one has that thought, through many lifetimes. And then an archangel, a higher being or a wider being, we could say, who has the capacity to accompany many human beings in communities, in groupings, in nations supremely. The idea of the spirit of a folk or of a nation. And beyond that, in the lowest, the nearest of the three angelic hierarchies, we have the so-called archai, the time spirits, whose consciousness can extend to embrace a whole humanity. So in the Gospels, there's this question that the theologians puzzle over when Jesus talks about how heaven and earth shall pass away, and my words shall not pass away. And then he talks about how the generation, the genea, the generation, today's generation, will not have died out before the end time breaks in. And some theologians think that that shows just how wrong Jesus was, because after all, the end time didn't break in his lifetime. And there are other ideas. But this word, this genea, what Jesus, I think, is talking about there is a present-day humanity. So all the human beings on the earth. I had one of those interesting experiences you can sometimes have. I think it was last year or the year before, when the official 7 billionth person was born. I don't know if you noticed that. And of course, it's a kind of lie. It's a sort of statistical fiction, because after all, we haven't actually counted everybody in the rainforests yet. Not yet. Coming soon. But it was a sort of reality as well, because the statisticians aren't only wrong. And I don't know if you caught it in the news, but it was greeted with almost universal dismay and despair. Now there's 7 billion people, because there's this hypothesis that the reason why we're short of food is because we have too many people. It's an interesting hypothesis that flies in the face of the evidence that there's far too much food on the earth. If only we would stop being too frightened to share it. So, doom and gloom about the 7 billionth person. And I had one of those wonderful moments that one sometimes has when you read the thing in the newspaper and you kind of get sucked along by the emotion that's there behind the report. So the emotion was, we're supposed to feel really bad about this. And I suddenly found myself feeling really, really happy and thinking, well, with 7 billion people, maybe there's a chance that we'll have enough people in our team that will be able to do what we've set out to do. So this is the thought that there is an intelligence which has a radius that can encompass the whole of humanity today. And of course, that probably doesn't only include incarnate souls. It probably includes those who've died and those on their way to the earth. But there's a reality to all the human beings who are alive today. And it's really that where I wanted to start in response to the changed context. Because these moments, like last night and today, in the aftermath of the events in Paris, where terror, which of course is an everyday reality, inflicted in part, perhaps for good reasons, perhaps for bad ones, through our armies and air forces. It's an everyday reality for large parts of the world. But when something happens like yesterday in Paris, suddenly terror comes quite close to us, very close to us. And one can, in such a moment, of course, one can ask, well, what's going on? So this would be also a moment to wonder, could it help me to think of the time, spirit of an embracing intelligence which also bears the purposes, bears the aims of humanity within it? How does such an intelligence look at the events that have been unfolding on the streets of Paris? Sometimes when I teach this subject, I do a little exercise with my students, and I ask them, how does the time spirit read the times? How does the angel of the age look at the newspaper? probably with rather different criteria than we have, because we can always notice how, well, today would be an example. I don't even know who all else died in the world yesterday, violently, and maybe even through terror tactics. And why is that? Because Paris interests me an awful lot more. And the newspaper editors know this, and so they cover the front 3 pages of the newspaper with all the horror of Paris. And, there's that law that if 3 people die in London, it's the first page news, and if 100 people die in Ankara, it's page 3, and if 1,000 people die in southern India, it's page 22. And nobody knows what happens in North Korea. So there is this kind of constitutional egotism that we have as human beings, because we can identify with things that are close to us. And if we imagine an intelligence that embraces the whole of humanity, we have to realize, well, in his newspaper, all the events there's only the front page. There's no inside pages. But then we can also ask, how does he evaluate what we're working on? How does he evaluate what's going on? And that would then be the question, very allied to our theme today. What have we taken on? We're part of a team of 7 billion. What is it that we're exploring? And what discoveries are we making? Maybe just leave that for a moment. So I'd like to just take the journey down the hierarchies and just think for a moment of the next level down from the all-embracing planetary intelligence, the humanity-wide intelligence, and then ask, can it be helpful to imagine that whenever we do something in a group, perhaps starting with the smallest group, all the way up to something like a nation, then there's a kind of counterpart. So we see ourselves sitting here, and we all feel quite glad that we got here, and we had our intention to arrive. And of course, the moment that we start thinking about the angels, we could kind of realize, well, perhaps our angels, they also filled an application form in the spiritual world. Maybe they even had a little pre-conference last night where they were aware that we were all going to be here. And each of our angels maybe, has a kind of to-do list of important meetings that could potentially happen if we woke up. But such a convocation of angels wants to become the vessel for a higher intelligence, probably not a fully fledged archangel, because after all, this is a temporary community, this community of this afternoon. But nevertheless, an angel that's on the way to archangelic status, so to speak. And one of the wonderful pictures of the spiritual beings that Rudolf Steiner gives us is that, unlike us, they really exist to interpenetrate each other. So on the earth, we have to work quite hard to make sure that we stay good and separate. And if somebody wants to take me over, that's usually fairly worrying, or actually always fairly worrying, and I should make sure I keep them out. But in the angelic world, that's really rather the other way around. So the angels love nothing more than to become vessels for archangelic beings. And that's where maybe we can start to feel how working with these ideas can be a help to us, because the archangelic beings also want to align themselves with the purposes of humanity altogether. And we can start to sense how to work out what's the quality of a group or a community that I get involved in. Because of course, human beings coming together in groups has a shadow side as well as a positive side. There is such a thing as cliques. There's such a thing as the wrong kind of nationalism, so to speak. And how do we know that? And then we could imagine that perhaps even this might give us some interpretive tools for looking at what's playing out on the streets of Paris, but in the skies over Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan perhaps just as much. That as humanity, what question are we grappling with? Now, if we had a whole afternoon and a whole weekend, we could come up with our own answers to that, and we would probably come up with a whole array of interesting different answers. One research question that I've been engaged in just trying to feel my way into what could be the purpose that the spirit of our age is bearing, to which every human grouping, every community, and ultimately every human individual needs to decide how to stand, either in a constructive relationship or in a rejecting relationship. So one question could be that we're grappling with the question, will we decide that fear or love is the most important power in the world? There's quite a lot of evidence that we think that fear is the most important power, even right down to the way that a word like terror has been pressed into service and gets used. And some of the responses that came up even yesterday and today, where there's a fairly strong and a very understandable reaction that if something frightening happens, then we'd better frighten back. That's the way the world works. So behind a sort of realpolitik and policy making, is there a kind of hypothesis about what we're on about as human beings? We're on about the struggle of fear against fear. But as Lawrence mentioned, we're also in an age where we can witness, partly even through, or definitely through, the communications revolution, our interlinked world, we can witness an amazing upsurge in love, in empathy, going far beyond national borders, people reaching out to each other around the world, not just by clicking on the like button in Facebook. That may be a fairly low level of empathy, but right down to quite heroic deeds and interventions that are made. Human individuals, the whistleblowers that we witnessed last year, or people who go and put themselves deliberately in harm's way to try and make something visible in war zones or occupation zones, and all of these phenomena. So there you can find evidence for this being the central struggle. And then the question would be whether having the thought that that isn't just the product of 7 billion people trying their best and getting through life, but rather that if we lift our consciousness to the level of trying to engage with the great struggle of humanity, we are putting ourselves in the service of the being of humanity today. So the question would be whether that helps us to do our work better, to be of service, to be loving in the world. So that is just a tiny introduction to a vast field, and the thought of the angelic hierarchy, what we usually call the angelic hierarchies, the intelligences which we can discover about and imagine at work in our individual destinies, in the life of our communities, of our groups, and on the scale of humanity itself. That would be the third hierarchy, the three ranks of angels that are closest to us. Then our gaze turns to the second hierarchy, which is bound up intimately with creation, and the first hierarchy, who are responsible for being itself. But that would go beyond what we have time for now. So just to round off this first contribution, we could just spend a few moments thinking our way, so to speak, up and down the ladder of these angelic beings. And again, I stress, it's not my intent to convince anybody of their reality or not, but simply to give the possibility of testing ideas for yourself. So the first step would be to just take a few moments and think about when you have been truly happy. And I'm using happy now in the sense that those who framed the American Bill of Rights really meant it. Sometimes people are very critical of America because they say, you see, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that shows you how superficial America is doomed to be. But the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, their idea of happiness was drawn from an image, for example, of a plow. A plow is happy when it's doing its work, the work that it was intended for. That's happiness, not having a Big Mac. The Big Mac thing is a later invention. So I'd invite you to reflect and just ask yourself, when did you feel truly happy, like a plow doing the work that it was intended for? So maybe let the detail of the experience fade away and see whether we can hold on to something of the essence. And probably again, if we had a lot of time, we could explore together. But you might discover that one of the feelings that you would describe would be a feeling of alignment, a feeling of oneness with your true self. And then the idea of the angel, and that we could maybe just contemplate on for a moment, would be the idea that we notice that we're not always happy. Some of us. Some of you maybe are always happy. But some of us sadly have the experience that we're not always so aligned. And then the thought would be that the angel represents that power in the world that is always in touch with my true purpose. That there is a guiding intelligence that, to use the traditional language, watches over me and bears within himself or herself itself my purpose in life. That thing with which I perhaps only occasionally really come into contact. So the idea of a continuity where we have a kind of interrupted consciousness. So perhaps just spend a couple of moments thinking of that. And then just to indicate what we practice there, which of course we know best because it's close to us. So the experience of alignment, the reflection that consciousness of my true purpose in life, the happiness that comes, is interrupted. The idea of a consciousness that carries that constantly, the kind of counterpart to my interrupted consciousness, well, that's transferable. So you could do the same thinking about your communities. You could think about moments when, as Lawrence mentioned, you experience the archangel's wing wafting behind you, perhaps in a community, in a staff meeting, in your board, where you've been struggling with a question. And then sometimes there's a kind of shift of consciousness. Somebody says something, nobody can remember afterwards who it was, maybe, and into a different kind of stillness, new thoughts come. So that might be the equivalent to being happy on the level of our communities, of our groups. And then the final step in this little round anyway would be to think of the same thing on the level of humanity. If we just occasionally manage, or occasional figures seem to tap in to what's really going on, and Nelson Mandela, for example, or other great figures who have the capacity to see the same and much, much more of the evils of the world than we do, and yet not be dismayed, still to be in touch with the purposes of humanity. And then the idea of the counterpart of an intelligence, a wisdom which can encompass everything that goes on and keep clear sight of the work that we've set ourselves as human beings. So that would be some homework. We don't have time to go through all the steps now, but starting with one's own experience, then one can build up into the higher hierarchies. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion that's coming up afterwards. Thank you. Thank you.